I had similar, viewpoints when I began training in the mid 80s. I studied and still do under Master Mark Santoshi Russo. And I would go out. I had to have my mom drive me out because I couldn't drive, didn't have a driver's license. So she would drive me out to Tampa and she would, sit on a bench and watch me train for 3 to 4 hours. And all I did was like, I just sucked up as much information as I possibly could. And then, like yourself or like any long distance student, when you first start out, you go back and you're by yourself. So you have to figure out, you got to get really creative and figure out ways on how I can work on this material without knowing if I'm doing it 100% correctly. So for me, I just did a whole bunch of kind of visualizing and fantasizing that I remember who my training partner was in front of me. I'm watching them throw this punch or reaching for my neck or grabbing a hold of my shoulders. And then I would just try to mimic as best as I could with muscle memory, how to shadow. It was a ton. I mean, it was all shadow boxing until I could get, a friend that was crazier than I was would be like, what is it? You want me to throw a punch at your face? Like, why? Why do you want me to do this? Okay, you're my friend. Kick me in the stomach. Kick me in the stomach. Grab for my legs. It was all about those things. So, the good part about that is when you find somebody first that you're training with as a long distance student that doesn't know what you're doing and they don't know what your goals are, they don't have a preconceived notion of what you're trying to do. So, like some of our ukes, if you know what the person is going to do to you, sometimes you will unknowingly assist them in their success. So things start to become less realistic. So that's the beauty of training with good friends, is your good friends will always try to screw you up, because they're messing with you. I mean, as teenagers, my buddy's like, okay, yeah, sure, I'll grab with my left hand. And all of a sudden he's smacking me in the head with his right hand, and you got to respond. So that was one of the ways that I learned this. But, from an elemental perspective, you read a lot of books, as we all have from Anshu. I mean, the whole collection as they were coming out back then. And then you start to aspire yourself to one of these elements just by reading about it, right? You start to realize like, oh, I realized early on that I was this fiery type of person. I was very outgoing. I wanted to get involved in things. I wanted to, I was always the kind of like, I hung out with some shady characters when I was in my teens. So I was always the one to be like communicating and trying to inspire, like, no. Don't run into the group of guys and start throwing your hands in their faces. Like, don't do that. So I was always the outgoing. I was the fiery, get involved, make an impression, inspire, that kind of thing. But I also realized that later I would deplete my energy, doing that. So while I was really good at it, I was killing myself energetically. So then once I literally took a step back, hence water movement, you start to pay attention to things that are going on around you instead of trying to always insert yourself into the middle of these things. So, that was, for me in the beginning, it was like, wow, these elements are so fascinating, but you don't have somebody consistent to be able to talk about them with. So you end up having to do a lot of thinking on your own. And then when you can go back to a teacher, you can throw all this stuff on the table and say, okay, this is what I've been working on for the past 6 months. Like, what do you think? Or like you send in a video and you get a response. Yeah. And, in your case, you're like, oh, okay, that was wrong. Here's a couple notes. I got to get back to it. So there is a lot of tenacity to be a long distance student, to stay, how hard is it to stay involved in something that it's in your face every day, let alone it's not in my face every day. I've got to wonder over a several months period of time if I'm even doing it right. But this is so intriguing. The art is so intriguing with this elemental aspect of how that plays itself out in your life that it's almost, for me, it was like, until I bought a car and then still had to drive an hour and a half to 2 hours to go and train. It was always like, what's the next page going to be like in my training? Like, what else am I going to learn about this earth? You know, what is it about inside of me that wants to learn how to be confident? And as you know, eloquently put it, you know, hold my ground and stabilize my position. And no, it doesn't go any further than right here. This is it. It stops right here. Enough is enough. It stops right here. Or, you know, transcending that and be like, you know what? I can't be right here. Holding my ground is the worst thing I could do right now. I need to back off of this. I need to take a look at what's going on, which is kind of like, I think, an interesting point right now that Anshu is relaying in his own way is, you know, there are those out there that feel like they are serving their purpose and getting out there and getting involved, and more power to them. Like, express that part of yourself. It is equally okay to say, you know what, this is kind of my time to back off and to watch what's going on and to observe everything that is happening around me. And then when I feel it's appropriate, I can choose. I don't have to be obligated. I can choose to allow myself to be inserted into whatever it is, you know, whether it's a current, you know, a current social situation or what's happening in my own daily life. But when I choose to get involved, I get involved with my entire heart. That's fire. If I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. I'm not going to half-ass it. I'm not just going to dip my toe in. I'm in, because I'm that confident with Earth. I know what it is that I need to do. I've done the study. I've done the water. Now I'm going to get involved, and I'm going to make the most of the situation that I can control. There's our fire. And then from the rest of that, it's just pure action, pure wind. I do the necessary thing that's appropriate. You know, as I like to kind of call wind, I yield space. I give up what I don't need to control, and I influence what I can without becoming attached to it. You know, that was what, for me, I really enjoyed. Before I realized I was fire, I loved wind because it was so, you know, the circular movement. That's what I really, you know, in a funny way, I kind of, you know, I admired when Steven Seagal started making movies, because that's how I came into all of it, right? Was by watching movies, and then I found my way to the books. But I enjoyed the early Steven Seagal movies, because he was whipping around. You could see on a screen, this wasn't like high flying spinning kicks. This was like, this guy's grounded and he's whipping dudes like they're rag dolls, you know? And I loved that. And the wind element encapsulated that so much. But to go beyond that and to be like, this is not only how I can move my body in a particular way, but I can learn how to move my intentions this way. I can learn how to be everywhere, nowhere at the same time, right? So I'm influencing people. I am allowing people to follow their natural course, and I fit into that process. This was huge for me when I was in the military. Huge when I was in the military, this wind element, to literally go with the ebb and the flow of things, and you will find out where you need to be at any given time. It was really a really big thing. So, you know, talking about the elements from my perspective as a long distance student, this also, I mean, you hit on it really good, Ron, but there was another gentleman that Hardy watched our Masters of To-Shin series of the interviews that you facilitated. And he really wanted to know, you know, like as a long distance guy, like how do these elements play out in my life? You know, because when you don't have a teacher that is there constantly being able to critique what it is that you're doing, to give you guidance in the elements, you're kind of, again, you're stuck to your own devices, but you don't know what you don't know. You know, so it's a challenge to get that information and then be able to see, how does this fit in with me? And then how do I work this beyond my own knowledge of the training that I currently have, so I can formulate better questions the next time I'm in front of a teacher. So that's kind of the long version of it all. So Hardy, I want to kind of throw it over to you as well. When you first started training, what was your training experience like? Was the North Carolina school established when you began training?
Yeah, it had opened 1 month before I walked into the door. So, you know, in my early training days, I was able to walk in. I had a fantastic instructor, Mr. Johnson, and he was the perfect instructor for me. I don't know that I would have stuck it out with anybody else, but he was hard nosed. I was sort of wild, getting in trouble, not being the fine, upstanding young man I've turned out to be, you know, but it was due to Mr. Johnson's, you know, sort of demand of like, if you're in here, you're going to do it. You're going to pay attention. The way he pushed the code of mindful action. And, you know, if you meditated on each piece of it as you went up to each level. And so I had instructors, I had solid instructors up until first degree black belt. And then at that point, I had a collection of mentors that were not so far away. I was completely out on my own, but it was personally directed training for a large part of it. So I was able to, contact them more directly. I wasn't in Australia and having to wait months to hear back from them. But I could connect with, we had Dr. Stack, and I could still connect with Mr. Johnson fairly regularly. Ian Pusick, who's up in Boulder now, spent some time as the head instructor here. So I had very fortunate to have a really good collection of people that I could get involved in. And then by that point, I was embedded in the Quest network enough that when we would go to events, I was able to talk to Master Russo. Mr. Hayes was really giving of his time early on, and several other black belts that I was able to, I sort of latched onto and, followed him around like a little kid, like, show me how you did that. Or, everything was magic to me, and still is at this point.
That's awesome. We have Mr. Norris was a personal student of Anshu's. I mean, still is, of course, but he is one of the 3 of our Shihan Kai senior advisory panel. And, aside from himself, Master Russo, another long distance student, has been his entire, To-Shin career. And he is one of those guys, along with Dennis Futoshi Mahoney, and a host of seniors. I'm looking at the feed right now, and we've got Maurice is tuning in from Atlanta, again a long distance student. You're dialed in, Hardy, directly to Anshu as well. You're a long distance student. Dennis Futoshi Mahoney, a long distance student. You've got a lot of seniors with a lot of skill, but that skill was not developed by having 2 times a week, 45 minutes to an hour and a half worth of training. It was cultivated by their will and their desire to learn this martial art. Because I personally don't know of, I don't want to say the words any other martial art, but most martial arts, you literally can look in the phone book or online or whatever your medium is, and you can find something that's within 20 minutes of where you are. To-Shin Do, not that way. It wasn't that way. And I think it's in part because of, as Anshu has said before, it's kind of its sophistication in that you have to put in a lot of time analyzing yourself to propel and project and to advance in this martial art. It's not a, here's your piece of paper, learn that, and then you get your next belt. There's a lot of self-exploration. There's a lot of disappointment. There's a lot of heartache. And, to be someone who has to, I remember stories from Master Russo where he was telling me, like, I flew out to California and I got off the plane, and of course, there were no cell phones at the time. You were looking at things on a map, right? And he was like, I thought it was in a certain area. It had a similar name as the location of the training. So, I just hitchhiked up the 105 until I could get to the training in California. He was like, I walked on the highway for a little while, and then I found where I could get to. So it's not, this is not a simple martial art to learn. So to those seniors that are still training and still evolving in this martial art, my hat's off to everybody as well, because it's just not simple. I'm looking at this feed here. Paul Blackmore is a long distance student who's just getting on the path out of St. George. So hello to Paul for tuning in, and all the other great long distance students that are out there chiming in as well.
Most of those long distance students that do stick it out and do fight the long fight to get to any level of note wind up opening a school, so they have their training partners, so they're not as long distance. So Ron, what time or what year did you open the Cairns Quest Center?
As a club, we were about 17 years ago.
About 17 years.
About 17 years
Wow.
ago as a club. As a Quest Center, when we moved from being an affiliated club to actual Cairns Quest Center, I think it's been about 12, 13 years now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, about 12 years. So long time, but it's been an awesome journey. It's been an amazing journey. I've enjoyed going over there and training with you guys. And I was actually thinking about what you said, Scott, with traveling to Tampa and how the process of, sitting and watching even Mr. Hayes for an hour and a half all day, some of the times we've had to, with him with festival and things like that. The process of remembering everything for me has changed a lot. Way back when I got my black belt, it was all on paper, it was all notes, and how do I write this down so I can remember it in the way I remember it? And then that's kind of evolved. And even as we came over every year, that process went from being on paper to all of a sudden, let's just quickly film ourselves doing that so that we can remember it that way. And, we were taking photos of things and so that process has definitely evolved to the point where now we can actually talk to each other and we could be training if you wanted to, you know what I mean? It's a great way. I mean, right now is a great time to be a long distance student, really, compared to when I started.
Well, I think particularly as well with our current, health concerns and what's going on, how has that affected you in Australia? Like how are things in your neck of the globe, as it were?
Well, I think we were about a month behind you guys. So, I mean, I kind of spoke to Hardy and he sort of told me, get ready, I think it's coming. And I sort of took that on and sort of got the students ready and made them aware that things may change pretty quickly. And then at one point we were the only quest center left open. You guys were all closed and I think we lasted about another 2 weeks. And then the Queensland government shut down all gyms. And I think that was the 29th of March that happened. And I lost 50% of the schools straight away, which was really, really tough week that week. But in that week, I also found out that I could stay open because we run an after-school care program for the kids that go to school. And the schools weren't closed to essential workers. So the schools were still open and any of the nurses, the daycare mums, teachers, anyone that was still actually working and had a job was considered an essential worker and their kids were allowed to go to school. So we sort of took it on ourselves to continue to keep picking them up and offering that service. So we were able to stay open for a couple more weeks. And then school holidays came and it's a 2-week period for that. So we closed during that period. And I took that period as an opportunity to create more videos on our members section on the website. We started an online private Facebook group and I started FaceTiming every single student I had left. And I would do a private FaceTime lesson with each one of them every day, or every week, one a week. They were getting one a week. But we were talking like 75, 80 students in a week that I was having to do a half-an-hour session with. And it was a pretty crazy 2 weeks. And then all of a sudden, we were allowed to do one-on-one. We were allowed to do one-on-one private lessons. And then that slowly grew to being siblings as well. So if we had 2 brothers that were in the same house, then we could train both of them together. I could train both of them together. And I was doing that for about a month, 6 weeks. And then about a month ago, they started allowing us to go to groups of 4 to 6. And then 2 weeks ago, we went to 20. We're at 20 right now. So we can have 20 in the room. And that looks like it might grow to around about 45 to 50 by around the middle of July. Somewhere around the 13th, 14th of July. But we'll see. It all depends on whether we have a second wave. And I mean, right now the borders are completely closed. The state's completely closed. We have other states in Australia that still have some numbers, but we've only got 1 case in Queensland and we haven't had a case in Cairns for about 2 months. So
that's great.
We're pretty lucky. It was pretty scary at the beginning and a lot of people have lost their jobs, unfortunately, but the government has got a pretty good subsidy plan, which is happening for everybody. Some of the businesses are getting looked after, which is great. Some have gone broke. And I mean, we'll see what happens over the coming months. I mean, we haven't opened anything up yet. So we're kind of doing things, making some changes, waiting 3 weeks to see how that goes, then make some more changes, wait 3 weeks, see how that goes. So we're slowly opening up, but we're worried that once we open the borders, are we going to let it all back in again? So yeah, we'll just see what happens.